Tim, thank you very much. And so John, thank you. That was a fantastic lecture on cryptology. I've never seen that before. I've learnt a lot this afternoon. My name's Adrian Leppard. I was the Commissioner of the City of London Police until December, and I've retired now. So I'm now working in this space, the private sector for temporary executives. The City of London Police, why would we be speaking to you anyway, had I still been Commissioner there? The City of London Police is the lead police force for the country on fraud and cyber. We uniquely in the UK take all cyber reports, all crime into one place for the country, and that's into the City of London Police. They analyse everything there, forward it on to other agencies and forward it back to police forces for further investigation. So quite knowledgeable about the scale of the problem in the UK. And I'll talk from that perspective this afternoon. I should add that although temporary executives are accredited to deliver training in this space, my lecture is not an accredited lecture. This is for you only this afternoon. I shall see how one of these things work, or push a label. There's a bit of a story I'm going to go through today, because the cyber threat that we face in terms of crime is significant, it's growing exponentially, and we don't have solutions for it. And that's the same the world over at the moment. But to understand why that's the case, you sort of need to understand a little bit about the story of policing. And that started in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel, when the first police force was formed in London. The City of London Police formed 10 years after that. The 9 Peelian principles he'd laid out there are superb and as right today as they were then. And if you look at them and you summarise them, it's pretty simple, that the basic mission of policing isn't actually arresting people, it is preventing crime. And the success measure of good policing is the fact that you don't have crime, not that you're doing a lot of work to try and enforce it. You do need public approval. You have to balance that. And you can see that public cooperation is vital, and that is the success to British policing today, that if we didn't have the willing support of the communities we work with, we would not be able to reduce crime, we wouldn't be able to detect it. Now, I paraphrase this at the bottom. So British policing is about effective crime prevention, not enforcing, and it has to have the voluntary support of the wider community, and its proportionate use of force is important, but the word proportionate is vital. That'll set the scene over the next few slides as I go through what we need to do to challenge the threat caused by cybercrime. I've summarised in that slide the journey for the last 170 or 180 odd years. And really, for about 150 to 160 of those years, it didn't change much. Policing was really a reactive service to the community. Visible policing on the ground, reacting to things it saw, reacting to crimes and other incidents. It was a reactive model. Now that started to break down and cause problems for us over time. And certainly when new technology came along and motor cars came along and we withdrew from the communities that were the bedrock of policing, and you can see that through the riots of the early 80s, that became a problem for us. We realised also that if we wanted to stop crime and go back to the basic mission, instead of being out there trying to enforce it, we needed to think through what was causing it and stop those things instead. And that was why in the early 80s through to the early 90s, British policing became intelligence-led. You would have thought it would have been already, but it wasn't actually. And what we started to do then was, instead of patrolling every area, we would think about where do we need patrol. When we looked at different crimes and offending, we would start to examine who are the people who commit crime and why do they commit crime. I do still remember in the early 80s the amount of money we spent on trying to chase around burglars, for example. It cost us a lot of money to put a surveillance team behind a burglar, sit outside their often London flat, see them get up about 2 in the afternoon, which is what they did, break into a house by about 4 in the afternoon, get rid of the stolen property and go straight to a drugs dealer to get drugs, to score, to crash out, to wake up the next day and do the same thing. And instead of spending thousands of pounds every day on surveillance and taking someone before a court for them to be bailed to commit a crime again, what we needed to do was get that person off heroin. And what we needed to do was work with health authorities. We needed to find a way in which we could stabilise the person, and that started to reduce the crime. We did the same with car theft when we realised that instead of trying to catch the people breaking into cars, we needed to design out the way in which a car radio could be stolen from a car. We did the same with housing estates, where it was difficult and it felt an offender could easily commit crime by changing how we build estates, how we build houses, how we build locks. So the whole shift change from the early 80s right through to today was a very intelligence-led policing approach, working with industry, working with communities, and reaching back into the communities we'd lost touch of as well, to make sure that we were looking after all of our communities. And that, if you like, is a story of policing up to the current day. We are, I think, the best police force in the world because of those measures, not because we run around and can arrest people, but because of the sophisticated way in which we think through how crime is committed and how we need to solve it. But those strengths also become limitations when we start to think through cyber and what is happening. So being intelligence-led means you have increasingly Rumsfeld moments. So you remember the comments of Rumsfeld during the weapons of mass destruction. We only know what we know. And the difficulty we have with cyber, and I'll come on to some of that in a minute, is if things aren't reported and go into the police system of crime reports or incidents, they do not exist in terms of intelligence-led policing. They just don't form part of the metrics of what is the problem in our society. And it's one of the biggest problems. And you'll see the scale of what I'm talking about in a second. We also have a very performance-driven culture. It was driven through, arguably, previous governments for the last 20 years that said all public sector need to be held to account for certain numerics and metrics. So if that metric is crime, the focus of the behaviour of all policing is to reduce crime. But the crime that we record and those things that become the local priorities are the things that the police will focus on at the expense of everything else. The difficulty with being performance-led is you do what you're measured on and you ignore other things. We're locally accountable, and that makes us a very sound, I think, and rich policing model for the world to follow. But when we're locally accountable, we are driven by what local people say is important. Unfortunately, sometimes the people who we speak to in local areas, I would call the vocal minority, don't necessarily represent all of the problems facing our society. I can't think last time when I went to a public meeting when cybercrime was the big threat that people wanted dealing with. It was more to do with whether kids were hanging around in the school, playing ground in a certain way that was causing aggravation, or people were cycling on the pavement. Minor things that are important to daily lives, but they miss cybercrime. Locally structured. By that, we're locally limited. Cyber is a global problem. It isn't something that you'll see in your local parish council or local authority either. And human rights. We're driven, and Tim mentioned it earlier on, we're driven very much about our human rights to privacy, which means that we have to be limited in our surveillance in what we can do, quite rightly. That limits us in what we can do in cyberspace. But I will bring back this other point, that equally within the human rights, there is a right to security. Everybody has a right to security under the ECHR laws. And it's something we don't give enough credence to, I think. Now, there's lots of issues to do with cyber. The threat facing society, you and me, whether it is child sexual exploitation or trolling, bullying online, a whole host of things with cyber. But I'm going to focus on fraud and give you one macro piece of the problem. And let me give you some scales to get people sort of concerned, rightly, I think, at a global level. 2.8 trillion, the global cost of fraud at the moment. And if you look at the bottom figure, 70% of fraud is now cyber-enabled. Put it in some context for the UK. PwC is saying at least 90% of all businesses breached last year, and it was the same on the PwC report for the year before. It's the same with SMEs as well as large corporates. 250,000 crime reports coming into the City of London Police reporting system, but more importantly is the bullet point after that. So the British Crime Survey, the England and Wales Crime Survey, asked questions for the first time on fraud and cybercrime this year, very first time. They've only had one quarter's data set in, it will be published this year. The first quarter's data set, when you extrapolate it out for a full year, will show that there are 5 million frauds a year in our society and 2.5 million cybercrimes. The British Crime Survey was recording only 7 million of all other crimes in this country until this point. So in an instant, cybercrime has become the most prevalent crime in our society, and yet only 250,000 crimes are reported to the police. That's a massive underreporting. So we have some challenges here when we go back to the premise that British policing and good policing is intelligence-led. It has to be driven by data, and when we see the problem, we start to react with it, and so does government in terms of policy and legislation and funding, that none of that data is on the books anywhere. And what's causing the threat? The nature of the threat, this first block on the left, and then I'll talk about the vulnerability and the limitations, but the nature of the threat itself. We think about crime and criminals, but the biggest capability out there on the internet is driven by states, countries, governments who are putting hundreds of millions or billions of dollars globally into each element of their business. Espionage, spying, whether it's our country or the US or every other country in this world is putting that level of money through their science into how they can spy on the internet. You'll see many people saying that actually you have already been breached. Every business has been breached. And the reason people challenge that is say, well, I can't see any evidence of that. And a spy doesn't. They're not there to leave any evidence of any of it. Another part of state capability is military. What a government wants to do in terms of war is defeat the other country. What people want to know is how can they shut down power or energy or finance in a country to cause damage. What state capability is trying to do is scope at the moment. How could it attack another country as well as trying to defend itself? All of that means incursions going on in the internet at the moment through businesses. Criminals, over 50 countries targeting the UK at the moment. Tens of thousands of organised crime groups all over the globe. This isn't just China or Russia. It is a global problem of a massive scale. So I would say, and we see certainly the data that have been considered under police growing every year, an exponential threat with a lot of state capability behind it, hundreds of billions of dollars behind it, some of that. I made the point about criminals actually to say that in the UK we think the cost of fraud is about £50 billion a year now. And if we think the global economy, criminal economy, is over $1 trillion, if you had a business growing at a rate of $1 trillion a year, how quickly would it grow? You know, it's not just the fact that this is new people coming in. The people who are doing it getting bigger and bigger and growing and getting better all the time because there's a lot of money going into them at the moment to get bigger. The growth of vulnerability. So once we got this trajectory of going exponential growth in threat, the vulnerability goes up at the same time. The internet, the society of things on the internet, all of us going digital, more and more people, more and more systems. We talked about in one of Sir John's slides the fact that everything is now becoming digital. It used to be that you'd have a digital front end and the things behind it were mechanical or analog. Now it runs right the way through, fly-by-wire aircraft, hospitals, power, energy, trains, everything digitally controlled. And I haven't touched on terrorists here because we haven't had a terrorist capability attack that sort of infrastructure. And we're hoping and praying they don't get that sort of capability. But my fear is that one day that may happen, and we need to be concerned very much about that. Businesses and infrastructure are increasingly going onto online, every sort of SME and corporate business out there. And I'll come on to the solution about that in a few slides from now, and the limitations of our response. So international is good for global business. International is difficult when you ask governments and policing to protect you. Governments cannot reach internationally. Policing cannot reach internationally. Only to those countries where we have extradition. And it's incredibly complex, costly and time-consuming to try and bring an offender back from another country. And if over 50%, 60, 70% of all the frauds in this country are from countries abroad, so the international threat coming into the UK, how can this country defend you? If it's coming through the technology called the internet, and it comes through therefore in completely unregulated infrastructure, how can the country defend you? You know, if you walk down the streets in the UK, you are in domestic UK land. British government has power on these streets. British policing has power on these streets. But the internet is like allowing the Wild West to come straight into your country, a totally uncontrolled, lawless society. It's a challenge. And I stand here as a retired police officer because that was my job, to protect. My job wasn't to stimulate business. My job was to protect society. So I will have a biased view on this. I'll try and make it balanced as best I can. Security standards I'll come to as well. At the moment, we don't have any set of standards that are commonly adopted in all countries. We have many standards and many parts of best practice out there that some people are adopting, but there are no set of common standards that are the best practice that people are adopting. The policing challenges, I think, I won't say anything you kind of worked out yourself really in the earlier part of my speech. The fast technology is actually, I suppose, amplified the challenge of technology by the fact that policing is always one step behind. So business is accelerating its technological growth. New products and new services are coming to market far quicker than anyone can think about the criminal application of them. And there is no governmental requirement for anyone in any business to take steps to protect a citizen when they bring a new product to market. So business grows rapidly, it produces more threat rapidly. Policing can't keep up with that growth. We need specialist capability in police forces to investigate crime, but we even need specialist capability to help people protect themselves. And whilst there is new training and new skills out there, they're slow and they're small compared to the scale of the rest of policing. And no way does it deal with the threat that we're facing. The investigations, if you take an investigation on, is extremely costly. Let me give you a feel for how costly it is and how difficult it is, just by volumes in this country at the moment. There's 7.5 million crimes. There's 250,000 crime reports per year. The capacity in policing is only able to deal with 60,000 of those crimes, and probably about 12,000 of them get a positive outcome. So you've got 12,000 as a positive outcome from 7.5 million crimes. That's the scale of the problem we're facing at the moment. International offending I've spoken to, the real challenge with jurisdiction. I can tell you in the investigations where we may make an inquiry to a country that is not necessarily one that's used to working with us, that inquiry will often fall foul, come back with no information at all. We'll track down an ISP, which is an internet service provider with an ISP address, and in an instant that address will be gone because actually that whole country is corrupt anyway. And for all I know, the governments in that country are part of that corruption. So it's incredibly difficult when you have international offending. And of course, we're still competing with local priorities set by local police and crime commissioners and chief constables who rightly are listening to their local communities who say, we want you to do this. And that doesn't go away. So those are some of the challenges. What's the government doing about it? Well, quite a lot, actually, but it's not enough. So you can't say this government isn't doing the right thing or isn't doing anything. We're looking at building capacity and capability in British policing, but it's a drop in the ocean. There isn't any significant new money or new resource for this type of crime, so police forces are having to struggle to reprioritise against a budget cut of the last 4 years of some 20-21%, even though they're protected over the next 4 years, but that doesn't deal with the scale of the new crime we're having to deal with at the moment. The government's put in place cyber strategy and a crime strategy. They're good strategies. They use a 4P approach, that's prevent, protect, prepare and pursue. They are good. But they work with, rather, they are designed to work with local communities and with local businesses. But I still feel there hasn't been a strong enough energy or leadership put behind those to make them very, very coherent with all of business and with all of our communities. Target hardening and prevention. So we've got a number of agencies doing a lot of things. Underneath the government's Cabinet Office, there's something called the CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team, and there's a Cyber Information Sharing Partnership. What's that doing? Giving out information to businesses if you're a member. And there's well over 1,000 members now who are getting information. The City of London Police release alerts to anyone who wants to go onto the email list. The Get Safe Online gives a lot of preventative advice. Action Fraud does. But it is random. If I said to you, how many of you know where to go? Hardly anyone put your hands up. I won't ask you. I know for a fact, because I've done it so many times. Here's the other thing I've done so many times. How many of you had an email attack or a scam or a card cloning, and over half of you have put your hands up? And I know that's the case as well. We are doing some work in target hardening, or rather the government are doing some work in target hardening, but it's nowhere near enough. It's nowhere near the scale of the campaign necessary for the challenge we're now facing. We're pursuing offenders better than we ever were. So the National Cybercrime Unit, part of the National Crime Agency, is working with the likes of the City of London Police, but also European agencies and US agencies like the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, US Secret Service. And the fight is being taken to those countries effectively. But it is like a needle in a haystack, a surgical insertion, and it will take out one group and another and another. But when you look at the scale of what's attacking us, it will not be the way in which we're going to solve this problem. It is just too small a scale. So we need a step change to policing in the digital age. We can see the threat and vulnerability growing exponentially. It is no over-dramatization to say that. Absolutely, although policing is doing its best, this capacity and capability is just not keeping pace with the scale of the problem. And let me say, this isn't unique to the UK. You can have this same conversation every Western world at the moment, being targeted in exactly the same way. Now, here's the thing, I suppose. To deliver a step change, we've got to change our approach and our thinking. Policing, which is what I'm speaking about really today, needs to start thinking about prevention and start really thinking wholesale about the private sector. The old traditional approach of enforcing or targeting offenders will not work in this space. And we really have to think hard about that. And it's a big mindset for policing to change this, because policing has grown up with the traditional notion that if we know where the problem is and we target the problem, we take out the offending, we will solve that problem. It will not work in this space. A new approach is enabling. Policing can and should still be victim focused. We can't simply allow 7.5 million crime victims to be in our country and not be engaging with them. That is the primary role of policing, to be the first step of understanding, engaging with victims, to also prevent re-victimisation, to start gathering the information necessary to build effective prevention strategies. We need new engagement with new communities. It's not right that the internet sits there as the Wild West. In some ways, policing of all the Western worlds need to start becoming the Pinkerton detectives of the old Wild West. We need to start getting marshals and sheriffs into virtual communities. Now, if we're not going to get the voluntary, I suppose, consent of industries who hold control over certain infrastructures that are using the internet, then we should just go there. Because many people, the majority of people, the vast majority of people using the internet, even the dark web, want to have a lawful society and are willing to help and support. And we need to start harnessing those. And I sort of go back to my old world of policing, where we had hard to reach communities in the 80s we were not engaging with, and we did start to engage with those communities, and those communities became the answer to all our crime problems. They helped solve the problems that we were trying to deal with at the time. So we need to start demonstrating cyber presence with virtual communities. The next thing we need to do is engage differently with our private sector. It would be good, wouldn't it, if we could encourage responsible business, that you can't take things to market that are using technology unless you've been through some steps to ensure that that business infrastructure is safe. You can't do that in one country. What I'm talking about over these last few boxes will have to be some sort of global agreement. You know, we've got Kyoto Agreement on the environment. We have many international agreements, whether it's G20 or United Nations. The internet demands some sort of global response about responsibility, whether it's businesses growing with security or safety. We're never going to be controlling the internet, but we can get agreement through countries to work coherently together. Incident reporting is a really important point. If we don't know the crimes, we don't know the intelligence of the people committing them or how they're being committed, we're never going to defeat this. So we've got to get information and crime reporting right. We've got to focus on also the infrastructures who are hosting access. If the internet reaches your home, how does it reach your home? If I went from here to Manchester, I know the road I need to drive on. I can go on a motorway or an A road. I know the people who built those roads. How does the internet reach your home? It reaches it through a host of internet service providers. Those are the people we need to have conversations with. I'm not so much interested in encryption for police's sake. I, like many other people, firmly believe that encryption is an important part of making our world secure on the internet, and I advocate encryption very much. I don't advocate any form of backdoor by any government agency, the way in which people can get into systems. I don't agree with that at all. But it would be good, wouldn't it, if internet service providers kept a history of what people were doing, that with government warrantary powers, they would have to provide that information. That's not quite the same as a backdoor for government agencies, but somebody needs to do something in this space. And I think we can also ask the private sector to help stimulate the inclusive communities that we need to fight the problem. Governments need to help form the global jurisdiction, or rather create enablers for the global jurisdiction challenges I've highlighted earlier. What does that mean? We have jurisdiction arrangements with certain countries. What could we do with international treaties that would enable better jurisdiction in these type of offences alone? Is one idea. Security and technology and standards. What more can we do globally to get a better set of standards around information security right at the heart of everything we're doing? Next slide here is some of those standards. Right in the middle box there, the 10 steps to cybersecurity through CSG, that's the government's sort of public-facing body, were brilliant first steps. They're a bit old now, but they stand true today. But they're very much technology-driven. The information assurance maturity model, a very thorough process, involves people and processes and technology, the point that Sir John was making earlier, the ISO 27001, the NIST standards in the US, the most recent cyber essentials. Now, there's plenty of standards. But actually, if I'm a businessman in London or anywhere else in this country, I don't have to do any of them. There's a legislation out there called the Data Protection Act. That may get some more teeth coming with new European legislation soon. What do we need to do to standardise some of this? Is it right that any business can hold your personal data without having to comply with minimum security standards? Isn't that where a government should be? Now, governments won't want to do this. I think the problem is so big that they must. A government won't want to do this if it's got international business like London with banking in New York and elsewhere. How can you create a law that's only going to work in the UK and not in New York? So what we have to do is work at sort of global treaty level in some of these. I'm not advocating a particular standard, but I do think there's a minimum set of standards that we should be saying globally, if you host data as part of your business, you must comply with these things. Otherwise, we in our countries will not allow you to do business in our countries. It's that sort of treaty that we need to start working through. And the future. I've talked about it there briefly. Industry standards and information security, I think, are really important, but they will not work unless they are global in some way, shape or form. It's pointless saying in the UK we're just going to do this. Nearly all of our business is global now. The public sector integration and collaboration is really important. Policing does, and the government does prevention by working with industry, but it does it almost as an add-on. It does its core business and then does some work with industry to help it further. The subtlety of what I'm trying to say is, in cyber, this has to be the mainstay. The only way a government can protect its society is through the private sector. So this means a wholesale change is to engaging with the private sector, not what you may see, and we often see, don't we, a bit of shop window, waving a flag to say, we've done a bit of work, look at this group here. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something that harnesses an entire sector from a government level, something that's going to cost hundreds of millions, whether it's a biz department or because it's cybersecurity or cabinet office, I'm not sure, but it is a government level approach that will take hundreds of millions to kickstart and stimulate this approach. And it needs to be backed up then with a standards regime and an approach that's different as well. Public information sharing. Where did you learn about drink drive? The television. Where did you learn about seatbelts? Probably the television. Now it's social media. Where are the public campaigns on cybersecurity? Now there should be a sort of public consciousness stimulated by hundreds of millions from this government into different sectors in our society, whether it's young people at school, whether it's retired people who are investing their money in savings and shares online, whether it's SME businesses or corporates of different sectors. If you're going to make this work and it touches you, it's not because you have to go and find something online. The government has found a way of touching you, wherever you are. Now that is a huge campaign and will take probably hundreds of millions to do that. National legislation needs to change. So one of the biggest challenges we had in my last career, I keep saying, I think until December, a Bitcoin exchange is a very interesting, pushing back the boundaries of what does this look like. So Bitcoin's exchange, although you keep hearing Bitcoin's a virtual currency associated with criminals, it's quite legitimate currency, and a lot of businesses advocating Bitcoin, and there are legitimate exchanges. And one was subject of a very significant robbery. Somebody online hacked them through a similar method that Sir John was talking about, a spear phishing that went into the administrative user of that business. So spear phishing, in other words, I know your name's John, I'm going to send you an email to John, and it looks very real because it's actually talking about my life, because someone's done a bit of social media research on my Facebook or something to know that my pet dog, or the fact that I like a certain community, a LinkedIn, I know you work in accounts. I just thought you'd be interested in going to the latest forum on so-and-so. It's at the Gresham College, blah, 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 blah. And it is linked to the Gresham College, but when you click on it, that's malware. Now that's spear phishing, not here's a random email. And it's very believable. It's very believable. And unless you happen to see there's one digit missing in the email address, and it's not to this particular company called Gresham College, it's Gresham dot something, and it's very, very similar. That is happening hundreds of thousands of times around the world every day, and the success rate is increasingly high. We need to change that. The legislation needs to move to either prevent it, or when I'm investigating it, and that particular Bitcoin involved a theft abroad, and I want to do surveillance, and here's my point, when I was a police officer and I want to deploy surveillance on a targeted person, because I now have a suspect, I cannot leave the shores of the UK. Spies can, policing can't. The powers are limited in what you could do globally, and yet the internet offending is all global. So we need a treaty that deals with surveillance, that is for all countries to use certain powers. A national police focus, it needs to shift. I don't think it's right that we just hands off our police force now and say, do you know what, everything's locally accountable, it's down to you, local police force, what you do. This is a national problem, and it has a global problem behind it. This is a government issue to wrestle with. This is a national government approach to the cybercrime problem in the UK. And that needs leadership, and needs a direction from government, what policing needs to do. My advocate, policing should be focused on victims prevention, leave the rest to the centre, and some government global department needs to be dealing with all of the international offending, National Crime Agency, City London Police, but other agencies as well. And then the prevention space, working with industry, needs to be led by governments as well. And I keep coming back to the international global jurisdictional arrangements. And none of this will work unless we can get a sign-up. That sign-up won't come unless all governments work together. Realistically, I don't think we'll ever see that until we have the equivalent of something like a 9/11 on the internet. And then every government will wake up. And then every government will think about it. But I fear it'll need something as significant as that to shake sort of electorate, to shake our politicians into action. And that's the end of the presentation. A gloomy presentation, I'm afraid. But I'm sort of concerned about the future, my job as a police officer, which is why I've sort of progressed into a cybersecurity company that's very focused at corporate board level, because it's actually a way of me continuing my mission of trying to protect society. And therefore, I'm advertising myself here on the last slide. There's some details for you. I'll pause there if that. Tim will come back to it. Thank you very much, everybody.